2013. I'm Ben Denniston. I'm here joined by Jason Ross. We're both of the basement team. We have Lyndon LaRouche on via Skype from Germany, and Jason's going to get us started.
Okay, well, I'd like to offer some thoughts on the recent Schiller Institute conference held in Frankfurt last weekend, or actually 2 weekends ago now. It was very interesting having this international conference because some of the things that came up really covered the whole spectrum of what's a new paradigm for civilization, which was the title of this ongoing series of conferences. One of the things that you think about is how do smaller nations act in a time like this? At least those of us here, we're being Americans and based in the U.S., we often think in terms of what the U.S.'s involvement is in this, but the role of other nations is an interesting one to consider. The speakers at the conference covered in very compelling and emotional detail the economic collapse that we're seeing around the world right now, and how in particular in places like Greece, Cyprus, also Ukraine, how the policies that are hegemonic today, the neoliberal, the free market outlook, are destroying nations. How Greece, or take Cyprus, which was one of the better off nations in Europe, within just a few years of adopting the euro, became a wreck, became a total wreck. Or Natalia Vitrenko, who covered the privatization and destruction of Ukraine after its independence, how it took a terrible path when it could have had one of development, instead was looted and destroyed. We also discussed the science of humanity, how it is that we move forward as a species. We discussed in quite a bit of detail some of the particular nuclear technologies that we could be implementing today. And we also very importantly discussed the future that we need to create, both scientifically as well as culturally, with a very, very important, crucial to the conference as a whole, cultural presentation, both the first evening with the concert and then the second day with the discussion of classical culture. We also had a fair amount of very excellent political orientation for the future in terms of how a credit system would work out, a report on the U.S. motion around Glass-Steagall as a very important flank. Because, as became clear in some discussions after the conference as well, we're facing a very powerful, seemingly, enemy, an imperial system that's been with us for centuries, not something of the British people, but the British Empire, the British financial empire, is merely the latest stage in something that goes back from Rome and through Venice. So what you need flanks. In the United States, Glass-Steagall is our very powerful flank, and as we've been discussing on this website, we've been having tremendous success of late in getting resolutions through various state houses and senates, with getting motion for more co-sponsors in the Congress on the H.R. 129 to restore Glass-Steagall. Another very important flank discussed at the conference was the 28 pages that are left out of the 9/11 Commission report. These pages, which implicate and discuss the role of Saudi Arabia in the original 9/11 attack, which we had been warning, Mr. LaRouche had been warning, if this is not uncovered, we are open to further attacks from the same apparatus that we've never actually investigated. What's the role of that in the recent events in Boston, for example? And then the other flank, the very large future-oriented flank as well, is the SDE. We heard some very good discussion of Russia's role in proposing and pulling together a concept of strategic defense of the Earth, both conceptually and with specific projects, including the increased funding for Russia's space program and the potential for Russia to put it on the agenda at the upcoming at the G20 meeting. Now, these are things that put us in a direction to define a new course. And these break through the idea that nations act in their own egotistical interests. This was brought up a fair amount, that Europe is acting, Northern Europe, there's this idea that Northern Europe is acting at the expense of Southern Europe, or that the U.S. is acting in its own interests in opposition to Russia, that the cause for ever since the from the Cold War, but then particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the U.S. has been acting in its own interests to further its cause of being able to dominate over the former Soviet bloc, which leaves out the role of the British Empire. This is a very big mistake to think that it's possible for maybe Russia and China to work together simply ignoring the United States, when if the United States isn't changed, we are on course for what will become a thermonuclear war. That's the strategic direction things are laid out in right now. So you have to lay out a new course for civilization. Now, philosophically, a couple of different concepts enter into this. One of them is a discussion about how decisions ought to be made. That is, how do we reach conclusions socially, as people, and as civilizations? This comes up very clearly, for example, in the criminal justice system, where there is both the question of who is right and who is wrong, as well as the procedure by which we come to such determinations. So the concept of due process, the concept of the necessary ability of people to defend themselves, things like this. These are principles of civilization about how conclusions can be reached in a social sense. But what's equally important, or what cannot be left out, is how does an individual determine the truth? How does an individual person, via a scientific method, come to a determination of what course ought to be taken? So this is the distinction between economic science as a social science and the approach taken by, say, a jurist, where you look at how does a legislature work, how does a judicial system work. That's different from looking at how a scientific system operates. In the world of science, we don't have pure hearsay. We don't have to continually concern ourselves with whether we're wrong. We always know that we are. There's always a new breakthrough to be had. But it is absolutely possible to reach breakthroughs in science that give us new powers over nature. It's also possible to develop principles of economics of a course we should adopt, which, if taken, will move mankind forward as a whole. If you look at what Kennedy did with the Apollo program, that was a scientific principle. That moved the economy forward. If you think about what the strategic defense of Earth could mean today as a paradigm for international cooperation, not only to defend us against threats from space, but as a required part of that, the scientific breakthroughs needed, as you've discussed quite a bit, Ben, to have the power over this region of the solar system, the development of fusion, which would be required, the development also of the laser and beam technologies that should have been part of the original Strategic Defense Initiative. These steps, if taken, will transform our relationship to nature. This is a project that we can really stand on as a paradigm for the future. And very importantly, it provides ground to stand on the military and strategic standpoint as well. This wouldn't simply be a scientific program. As a defense program, as one which could certainly potentially involve nuclear weapons, this engages the military community and the political community as well. There's some discussion about plans for space-based laser systems to push back asteroids by vaporizing a part of them which would act as a thruster. Obviously, a powerful laser system like that in Earth orbit would have to be under international cooperation, because you could obviously focus it on the Earth if you wanted to. So, as a direction, there are principles of science that aren't up for debate, or that aren't determined by popular opinion, that really are principles of science. And what you, Mr. LaRouche, have laid out over the course of your work as an economist of what we need to do right now, including the Glass-Steagall, the credit system to make possible these projects, and then, very importantly, having specific projects in mind. If you don't have a direction you want to go in, trying to implement a credit system just becomes monetary inflation. You can't just make money and hope it goes somewhere good. The whole concept behind credit is that you have to have a science of knowing where ought this money to be invested. Where should this credit go? What's going to achieve a big return? So part of this science of economics is also a cultural question. So I'd like to say some about the cultural discussions that we had the first evening and then closing out the conference. Antonella Benauti, the Italian opera singer, she had said at the concluding panel that what you have to create as a true artist in being a protagonist in the universe is you're not creating a dream so much as you are creating a vision. That you have an active role in your work as an artist in creating a concept. And I know that it's very difficult to talk about now. It was also, I found it difficult to discuss at the conference the impact that the musical presentations the first night of the works by Verdi at the Verdi Scientific Tuning of A432 and of the very incredible performance of the Mozart Requiem had on the audience, on how these pieces really changed the listeners. And I know that in talking with people afterwards, we all knew that something happened. It was very difficult to say what that thing was.
But the problem is that we, as mankind, have all these wonderful qualities which differentiate us from the animal species generally, but we don't use it. And we are also dominated still by what's called the oligarchical system, typified by the Roman Empire, and there's no difference essentially in principle between the Roman Empire and the British Empire. They're both the same thing. They're extensions of the same process. They may dress a little funnier than others, but they are all that. And they also have the peculiar characteristic that whereas all living species depend upon progressive evolution to higher energy flux density states, we have the Roman Empire of today, which is the British Empire, and the British Empire is nothing but the continuation of the Roman Empire. We are now going on reducing the human species to a lesser quantity and to a lesser quality, when we should know that doing that creates inherently a precondition for the destruction of the existence of the human species, entirely against our nature. And these factors, which could be dealt with at much greater length and much greater detail, but I think for this occasion what I just said is probably a good reference point, that we have this terrible irony of what mankind is capable of doing. Mankind does, in many respects, often struggle to realize what its destiny is, but then we don't live up to that. And therefore we get into deep trouble. We develop social systems and political systems that are not suitable for a civilized mankind. But we adopt those conventions and we suffer as a result. So the problem essentially is we do not understand what the optimal option is. The optimal is that we should go into space. We go to Mars. It's a necessity. We're not quite clear on what that necessity is, but we know that exists. Like dealing with asteroids is a necessity. So we have to do it. We don't fully understand what we're doing. We do know, however, we require thermonuclear fusion as a driver for travel to Mars and the other things we're going to do on Mars and other places. So, and we're not living up to that now. So we have the contrast thus between mankind is a principled creature, which is unlike any other living creature of which we know. We tend to progress. We tend to manifest that, but we often fail to do so. And thus we get into a mess. And now I think what we in particular, in what we're doing, is exactly that. We're trying to push people in society into recognizing that there are qualitative changes in the condition of man's behavior, man's self-conception, man's role in the universe, and we just aren't living up to it.
I think that's a